Welcome to our Cartus webinar series, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. We'll be presenting a series of webinars with various topics impacting our mobility industry, given how quickly the landscape is changing. A recording of this and other webinars, like our most recent APAC virtual forum, are located on our Cartus Content Hub. My name is Yola Harb, and I will be your moderator today. I started with Cartus 22 years ago as a consultant and have grown up in the industry, having supported organizations in operations and account management, and currently in our business development team. We've all seen different crises throughout our careers, but certainly nothing like this. Today, our supply chain partners share their perspectives on what the global mobility landscape may look like as the world begins to reopen for business. We certainly understand this is a fluid situation, but did want to start focusing on the light at the end of the tunnel. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to highlight some key housekeeping items. If you're having any technical issues, please drop off and rejoin the webinar. This call is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. Attendees are in listen mode only. If you have any questions, please use the question area in the webinar, which has a voting feature. I know the panel will be very engaging with their topics, so if we're not able to get the questions that you put up in the panel, then we'll be sure to get to our panelists to give their perspectives on the top questions and send out to everyone who joined us today. CRP GMS credit information will be available at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce our panel of industry experts and kick off the discussions. Joining us today is Beth Snow with Fragaman, Bob Thomas with Allied and North American International Moving Services, Meredith Kennedy with Dwellworks, and Steve Frey with Oasis Corporate Housing. So as we know, the impact from the pandemic has come in a wave, and everyone anticipates the restrictions will be lifted in the same way they were implemented, starting with Asia and working its way across to the Americas. So we wanted to give it and gain a better understanding from our supplier partners who have people on the ground, what the first 30 days may look like as the restrictions in the regions begin to lift. So let's kick off the discussion with Beth and immigration. Beth, typically immigration is the first support service for a relocation. From your perspective, what will that first month look like, and what should companies and their employees expect as different parts of the world lift restrictions?
Hey, Beth, you're on mute.
Thanks, Yola. I think whenever we have a conversation about immigration in the context of the coronavirus or COVID-19, we need to talk about two factors. One is government processing, and the other factor is travel, particularly the travel bans. Because as we all know, many people cannot travel into a host location without the proper visas or authorization. And even if you have that authorization and the borders aren't open, you're not going to get anywhere. So with that in mind, when we talk about what we can expect on day one, as you noted, it's important to recognize that this isn't going to happen like the flip of a switch. It's going to be a process. So just as the virus and quarantines and other restrictions sort of moved from Asia through Europe and then to the Americas, when business resumes, we can expect to see a very similar pattern. And then even within that, as countries and regions start to reopen or come back online, we're again likely to see phases. Local quarantines will be lifted, businesses and government operations will resume, and then borders will reopen. Maybe in that order, or maybe not. It's a little too soon to make a clear determination on that. But again, it's just that idea that this is going to come in phases. So in terms of immigration, what can we expect? Well, if we're talking about that first tenet, that idea of government processing, I can't say this loudly or strongly enough, but we all need to expect delays. By the time the governments start to reopen, many will have been closed for several weeks, or in the case of Switzerland, several months. So we've got to realize that if an organization had submitted an application for work authorization before this all started, or if your business is planning to lodge a new application as soon as the doors reopen, please realize that that application is going to be stuck in a backlog. How long will that delay be? That's a wait and see question that we at Fragment are monitoring very closely. But it is safe to say that we should expect delays, and we need to factor that into our projected lead times and our projected start date. Along with that, for either applications that have already been submitted and are presently on hold, or applications that we're getting ready to submit on day one, we shall be prepared to submit additional information, either regarding the present health of the applicant, so possibly additional medical testing, or possibly additional information about medical insurance. I think we can expect to see maybe higher standards or higher premiums for corporate provided health insurance. I think it's also fair to expect priority will be given to applicants from certain industries, possibly healthcare workers, pharmaceutical companies, and certain types of manufacturing. And then when we go back to that second component about travel, when the borders reopen and we're starting to plan travel again, I would really urge anyone who has received any sort of consular visa or work authorization before this shutdown, and maybe they were unable to use it, I'd strongly recommend that they check with their immigration partner or with the issuer of that visa before they attempt to travel, to make sure that it is indeed still valid. Again, Fragment and most other immigration partners will be closely monitoring this, but it's an important note that just because something was issued maybe back in early March, it may not be valid once those borders reopen. So we don't want to see anyone stuck at an airport.
Thanks, Beth, for that. So Bob, from the moving industry, right, household goods industries, obviously you're touching both international and U.S. domestic moves. What are you starting to see? Is there anything that you would certainly expect to see now in the Asia region and then coming over through the Americas? And what are you seeing in the Americas, in the United States, pertaining to your industry?
Yeah, well, similar to what Beth mentioned, as these countries begin to relax the restrictions, there are going to be delays. What we're seeing in Asia, some of the countries are still on lockdown. They're being extended, some now until May 3rd. Country by country is handling these different. So it won't be, just as Beth mentioned, it won't be a switch. It's going to be a dimmer. It's going to be turned on slowly. And I think there are going to be limited services that are offered. Now, as countries open up and return to some sort of business, it might be that the packing and labor workforce is able to at least go into the homes, pack up the goods, but then depending on the destination restrictions where that transferee or assignee is heading might not be completely opened. So we anticipate seeing more into agents' warehouse at origin. And then once we do have those in origin, we have the issue of congestion and capacity at the ports, getting containers. Once the restrictions are opened, we believe that manufacturing will take some sort of priority. Those issues where manufacturing gets bumped ahead of household goods makes it difficult to get containers dropped. We do see congestion at the ports currently because many of the manufacturers are holding goods in the container at the port, waiting for stores to free up space in their warehouses. So getting that congestion cleared, getting the containers available to drop at agents' warehouse to get those loaded, we do see some issues then coming into the Americas or wherever these countries are relaxing the restrictions to then have future port congestion, combined with, as Beth mentioned, everything that was in process went to the origin agent's warehouse. They need to get moved, plus additional transferees trying to get packed and moved. We might see the port congestion increase during this reset time. And in those cases, we do see some carriers divert these containers to alternate ports, which then we have the challenge of getting the household goods from one port to the destined port where they were intended. So we do see those issues, including customs being on a bit of a backlog. Same aspect that Beth had mentioned of we have all this paperwork that was in process. Customs might not be opening up as quickly. We have that backlog and trying to get customs cleared. But we do expect these delays. We do expect additional charges because of everything going through agents' warehouses, port charges, demurrage, detention, those issues because shipments are delayed at port and held at port. So it is going to be one of those issues that we are monitoring real time. We do get impact reports on a daily basis for which countries are opening up. Are they limited services? Are they full services? We have to engage with the transferee on expectations. And then, of course, where they're going overseas, do we have the green light to send to those countries overseas, or are they still in restricted services? So it's going to be something that we're going to have to expect a lot of patience, delays, and expect some increase in costs.
So, Bob, from a freight perspective and shipment perspective, do you see this impacting air shipments as well, or is it? Do you find that might be easier for organizations to be able to at least ship some air freight to the countries that are starting to reopen?
It may be with immediate needs, but there's going to be limited air freight capacity as well. As you know, the majority of household goods travel on cargo carriers. So those have not been, the planes are not necessarily all in the right places either. So there will be limited air capacity. And again, for any perishable or immediate needs, they may take priority over household goods. Household goods may get bumped, but air freight might be an alternative. In Europe, additional trucking might be an option. That is a little bit more expensive than traditional, either air or through sea. We're going to look at what options are available. And again, it's going to depend on when countries are opening up, what kind of services are available at origin and destination, so we can match it up.
And the U.S. impact at this point, like U.S. domestic pieces of moving goods around, anything that you see on that side?
We do see most states are open. There are a lot of protective measures that the U.S. agents are putting into place, but movement is still occurring. Packings are still occurring. Deliveries are still occurring. Depends on, New York right now is the hardest hit area, but we do have some agents in those markets still operating under tight requirements to make sure that we have the health and safety of the crews as well as the assignee who is moving. So we do see more of movement within the U.S., although it is quite a bit reduced than what it has typically been.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Meredith, obviously similar to question to you, certainly interested in what your agents who are on the ground, who have been on the ground right throughout the pandemic in the countries around the world, what are you hearing from them? What are they seeing? And, especially, as we hopefully start to emerge from the pandemic, what are you seeing across the globe?
Yeah, thanks, Yola. I definitely have to echo what you've all said in that it's looking very different in various regions as different countries come online at different times and define that in different ways. So as far as destination services are concerned, we're really going at it with an approach of being fluid between providing virtually accompanied service where necessary and then applying social distancing mixed with responsible hygiene where possible. So we are benefiting from the learnings of the many countries that we are in. So, for example, I think you could maybe say that we're already in the first month back in China, at least in terms of our ability to work in country. So, of course, the problem there is that there are restrictions on anyone actually entering the country. So we are now assisting with tasks for assignees who were already in location and maybe had been sheltered in place or in quarantine. We're now actively engaging with them in person carefully, but we aren't assisting new assignees arriving at this time. In other cases, I think we anticipate that companies could send assignees to new locations because maybe restrictions on air travel are opened up, but then they're actually required to be placed on mandatory self-quarantine, things of that nature. I think even in the US, I could picture that happening, that travel restriction gets opened up on a national level, and yet there could still be shelter-in-place requirements on a state or local level. So just kind of watching and anticipating what may happen there. We're trying to find out, just, figure out exactly how much we can do for the assignees, offering some additional concierge type services that weren't typically on our menu, things like arranging for grocery delivery, suggesting reputable resources so that they have access to the right well-vetted information, offering lists of local hospitals, of course, and the published protocol if you do develop symptoms of the virus. And then some more fun things like the local libraries that have online programming, gyms with online training, exercise, yoga classes. So we're still really in touch with the assignees who are on the ground right now, making sure that our DSCs continue to be that local lifeline in all countries where we're operating, hoping to add some comfort at this time of uncertainty. And also, hoping to proactively expedite the eventual acclimation, home finding, and settling in process that we'll be able to deliver when we're fully back open for business.
Great, thanks, Meredith. It looks like your groups have certainly had to adjust very quickly, right, to the pandemic and the impact of the whole social distancing with people who are usually they see face to face, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Yola, if I can continue, I would just comment on that very specifically. Right when the pandemic began, we jumped to action to modify our virtual services. We're actually calling them virtually accompanied because we're trying to be with the people as much as we possibly can through video apps. Our consultants are using Skype, FaceTime, Google Hangout, WhatsApp, WeChat, anything you can imagine that is suitable to the assignee or relocating employee. So we're not just, chatting through those apps, we're actually really guiding the assignees through the tasks that maybe they needed to accomplish without our in-person assistance. We're checking in with them before to make sure they're fully prepared. We're checking in with them during, making ourselves available to talk to service providers on the phone while they're accomplishing tasks, and then working with them after to ensure satisfaction of the service completion. So that had all gone into a place kind of right when things were hitting. Now we're kind of in a spot where there's really not much that we can do. There's not services that they can really accomplish, but we're ready to have those services reactivated on this ramp up. So I'm really excited about that. We even were doing some virtual property tours, so we anticipate getting back to that as soon as we get back, fully to work in these different countries. One last kind of best practice that we adapted was Dwellworks has a mobile app that we use for property walkthroughs, and we were able to modify that so that our DSCs could use it. And normally our DSCs use it, but we modified it so that the assignees could use it directly, so that they at least had a professional way to document their property conditions, store their pictures, etc. So again, we'll be redeploying those tools as soon as we can.
Thank you, Meredith. With that, though, and the whole virtual tour, do you anticipate that, and have you heard from your teams on the ground that employees who are relocating may be a bit hesitant to go into properties or to, access several different properties when it comes to, doing that home finding and finding their new home in their, new location? Have you heard anything from your people on the ground about that?
Yeah, we're really, really aware that this is impacting people in different ways. So different destination services consultants and different relocating employees are going to have different levels of comfort with engaging in public and accomplishing those tools. So there's going to be a lot of options in what we're offering. We appreciate leeway from clients in terms of what our DSCs are willing to do as their particular area comes back online. And we want to adapt our services and make our offerings as flexible to the assignees' needs. So yes, specifically going into different properties, you can imagine a day of destination services could be, running from property to property, school to school, those kinds of things where you're really accomplishing a lot. You're interacting with a lot of people. You're shaking a lot of hands. Obviously, the shaking hands is out of the question, but I think the virtual tours is a way that we can take some of that pressure off of the assignees, have our DSCs do those virtual tours, and have them prepared and not require that the employees are actually visiting the properties directly. So looking into a lot of things that we can do by video, by picture, et cetera.
Perfect. Thanks, Meredith.
Yeah.
Steve, obviously similar situation for temp housing, but as you look at the first month of these regions coming back up, what do you feel companies and their employees should expect? As these restrictions get lifted, what are you seeing in your industry? We've certainly heard a lot about the corporate housing industry, possibly even reduction in the housing availabilities. So if you could take us through from the global side to the U.S. Domestic business, what that looks like for you.
Sure. So it is important to kind of break this up into two different categories of inside the U.S. and outside the U.S. Just because the United States operates in a very unique way compared to the rest of the world as it relates to temporary housing. In the U.S., as everybody may be aware, it's pretty typical for there to be a local corporate housing provider that holds long-term inventory and then rotates people in and out of those particular apartments. As coronavirus made its way into the United States, the occupancy levels of all of these apartments went way down, as you could expect. But the obligation for a lot of these local temporary housing providers in these local markets did not go away. And so as a result, what we've seen is some providers having to literally show up back with a bag of keys and go into the leasing office and say, here you go, I can't pay for these. As a result, there's significantly less availability in the United States as it sits today. Doesn't necessarily mean it won't come back as demand continues to ramp back up, but as it sits today, in order for these local providers to survive, they had to shed a lot of these empty vacant apartments. And the reason why that's different compared to the rest of the world is where that is what we would consider more of a variable type of approach towards supply outside the United States, where there are service department buildings that are very static. It's brick and mortar on a particular street at a particular location, just like a hotel, that when the demand declines, it doesn't mean that building goes away. So those buildings are still there. So where you're seeing some contracting of supply in the United States, outside the United States, there's ample supply. And so as a result, and I think we spoke about this or emailed about it, as a result, what we're seeing outside the United States is a bit of a drop in the rates that we're seeing at some service department buildings. So there is some hopefully cost-saving type of measures that are going to go into place to help drive demand, some of these static inventory buildings. But just to kind of break those two things up in your own mind when you're thinking about temporary housing as it starts to come back over the first month, there may be some supply restriction or contraction within the United States, but ample supply outside.
And so, Steve, with that, those restrictions, what are you recommending for companies and organizations as far as being aware, right, of the limited housing, especially within the U.S.? What are you recommending to those organizations who certainly need to continue to move their people, especially in the areas, right, so certain manufacturing or pharmaceutical groups who it is important for them to continue to move that business into some of the, big major cities like a Boston or, California area?
Yeah. So I mean, what I think I would do if I was sitting in that seat would be more of a phased approach. Understanding also not only has supply been contracting, but also the staff, the labor force of your suppliers in these local markets in an effort to cut costs. Some may have been furloughed. We all know that the summertime can be a big surge in demand in this industry. And so as we're approaching summertime, a lot of companies would bring in additional labor resources to be able to help support that increase and spike in demand. Most companies have not decided they're going to go hire an additional labor force at this time. So the labor that we usually have in place to be able to maintain being able to support these high levels of demand may have been somewhat diminished. So looking at the supply reduction, as well as maybe not the same level of support from staffing, I would think about taking more of a phased approach towards bringing our people and relocations coming back into the market. Not only would I think about it from the ability to maintain high service standards throughout that process, but also maybe spread the relocations over into the winter months or fall months a little bit more to see a more gradual approach, so we know the infrastructure of all these services can support at the level that we all expect that it can be done. One additional thought that maybe I would put into it is, if there are these additional waves that come in the future that may require people to go back into quarantine, that to think about when you are looking at temporary housing, will that support a quarantine need? So if you're looking at relocating your most critical people first to get them there, if that additional wave comes back, is it an appropriate accommodation for somebody to be able to quarantine in place with where they're at? And so, I just think about if people have families or maybe not. I mean, we've all had kids kind of running around if you have kids around your house. And so to be able to work, maybe have a separate bedroom added, I don't know, something like that, to be able to accommodate if they have to quarantine in temporary housing.
Steve, I actually asked Meredith a little while ago just about the hesitation, right, in going into an apartment. And this is more typically, right, permanent residence. But for you with the corporate housing industry, sometimes it's people that are there for 30 days and then the next group of family comes through for the next 30 days. So what measures are you seeing and are you taking in your industry to ensure those who are moving into those temp housing, accommodations, the concerns that they may have over, the COVID-19 pandemic, contamination? What are you guys doing, and what's been discussed within the corporate housing world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are the things that we can do, and then there's the things that nobody really has control over, right? And so all cleaning staffs that operate service departments or corporate housing properties have really increased their amount of cleaning that's going on, using disinfectants and swapping out linens, doing everything they can. Does that mean that there can be a guarantee? Of course not. Does that mean that, I think just like we were speaking of earlier, there's a different level of comfort from different people. So in terms of what we can do, it's related to the cleanliness procedures and what we're doing to make sure that everything's being disinfected and linens being swapped out. And I think our industry's responded pretty well to that. But I think everybody's kind of, nobody wants to take that. I guarantee there can't ever be an exposure, because I don't think there are any guarantees right now in this particular landscape.
Yeah, completely understand and agree with that. Beth, I was going to, we want to get to one last question before we open it up to the Q&A that is coming in from our attendees. So for the corporate people who are on the phone with us today, what would you ask them to be especially careful about or watch out for as, the world comes back online? So what are your maybe top top 3 items that you would say, hey, do this, and it'll be more successful for them and their employees, and get that experience, that customer experience that we all want to ensure is in place?
Just to echo what everyone's saying, I think first and foremost, we all need to be prepared for delays. For as much as we all want to focus on customer service, there's just going to be some things that are out of our control because we've all essentially been, in quarantine or, almost in hibernation or for the past few weeks or months, depending on the region. I think we also have to be very mindful of change, changing regulations, changing, whether it's the re-implementation of a quarantine or just changing regulations from our governments. We need to be monitoring that independently, and also relying on the network providers to be flagging recent changes so that we all can react to that accordingly when we're mapping out our moves and the time frames. The other thing that I'd be really cognizant of, at least from an immigration standpoint, are grace periods. Over the past few weeks, a lot of different government authorities have been issuing notices that work authorizations or residence permits that were set to expire in Q2 are going to be extended for an automatic 30 or 60 or 90 days. While this is helpful, especially considering all the delays that we've been talking about, it's important that we are not taking these for granted, that we're paying attention to what sort of permits or visas would warrant that extension, and the implications of those. From an immigration perspective and as an immigration provider, the last thing we want is for any of our clients' workforces to be caught in an area where they're non-compliant, where either they can't work or actually they can't be in the country. So I think we really need to pay close attention to any upcoming expiry dates, and with a particular focus on whether or not there's a grace period that's allowed, just to make sure that we are all staying compliant.
Great, thanks, Beth. Bob, same to you, because I think it's really important, right, that we focus on what are really those critical items to watch out for companies who are relocating their employees. So maybe a little bit on the international, and then as well U.S. domestic. And I know I see some Q&A for you that's going to be coming up, but let's hit this last question, and then I'll shoot over the Q&A to you after we go through.
Yeah, thanks, Yola. Again, a lot of it is setting the expectations. We are working with agents around the world, different capacities, limited capacities in different parts of the world. But if we are setting the expectations with the assignees from the start, we can have a more positive experience. And this has also forced agents around the world to do business differently, which is a good thing in some ways. We are doing more virtual surveys. We are engaged in, more sanitizing procedures to ensure the safety of the crews as well as the transferees. They are doing things differently in the sort of using crew technology, application technology, to limit the use of paperwork, for example. So whereas in the past, a lot of the agents around the world were slow to adopt new technologies, this has kind of forced a change in how they are handling the business and setting the expectation with the transferee of how the agents will engage them is also going to be key during this time and in the future. For goodness sakes, or hopefully we don't have any more waves of outbreaks, but limiting the contact, less paper, more applications, virtual surveys whereas they already have sanitizing procedures. They're accelerating those sanitizing procedures. The crews are available. Just the interactions are going to be a little bit different, I think, go forward than they have historically. But it's setting that expectation, and with the move consultant who might be handling that coordination to ensure that there are no surprises that pop up, that this is what's going to happen at origin. This is what may happen during the freight process if it's either an air carrier, an ocean carrier, or even trucking for intra-Europe, and then what may happen at destination, giving all the limitations that are currently in place. But it's really setting that expectation to ensure that we have as positive an experience as possible given the circumstances.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. Meredith, from a destination service provider perspective and your teams on the ground, obviously they're the ones that are really engaging with that employee, and really that first customer experience sometimes is coming from them. What would you want to kind of highlight for corporate organizations on the call today? What should they be watching out for, and making sure that their employees as well are watching out for?
Yeah, sure. I think from a really practical standpoint, a few of the things to be on alert for is, I think we do anticipate we could see some housing supply demand imbalances. It's really hard to predict exactly where that's going to happen, but I have to imagine that there are people who have had to stay put for a bit, and they may not be comfortable, ready, allowed to move out in time for the next group of people to be moving in. So we're watching that very carefully. I think clients should be aware of that. We're staying very close to local real estate agents, landlords, building management companies, et cetera. And we'll be reporting back to Cartus on availability and pricing expectations, but I think we could see some changes there that we should be on alert for. Even, little but important matters like schools. I think in some countries, schools could be closed until the following school year. It might be challenging for us to actually preview schools, visit schools, while they're exercising an abundance of caution for their students and staff. So that's something that might need to be altered. Just again, the unpredictability of it all, I think is difficult for people, and we want to make sure that we're doing our part. As you said, Yola, we're in person with them, or we're at least more connected with them in a local kind of way. So we're trying to really be that local lifeline, bring them a sense of calm, and by information. And I think I would just encourage clients to do the same. Don't forget those people who do want to hear from you. I think in a time of uncertainty, people want more communication. So I think that goes for direct communication to those employees. And then, of course, through the supply chain, I think as much advance notice as your clients can provide to Cartus and Cartus can provide to us will give us the opportunity to make sure that our team and our service solutions are completely ready for when that volume does turn back on. Obviously, that's really critical to us, and we're preparing for that by staying really in touch with that supply chain, our destination services consultants on the ground, trying to really get a sense of what's worrying them, what their status is, what their capacity is, what their willingness is, so that we can adjust and build our supply chain if necessary, make sure that we're ready for the volume that we know is eventually coming back. But again, we feel a real sense of responsibility for the duty of care, both for the customers and for the employees that are working with your customers. So we want to make sure that that balance is correct, that we're talking through the flexibility of options. Sometimes, again, that flexibility also means that at the water cooler when they meet, the experience that they had is going to be different from the experience that their colleague had a month ago, or that their colleague had in a different location. So I guess that's the other thing I would ask, is just helping make those employees understand that it's just not going to be the same. We used to really pride ourselves on service consistency around the globe. Well, of course, we needed to allow for local nuance. And I think we're taking that concept of allowing for local nuance to a whole new level. So I think that's my last comment I would make, is just your help in understanding that that's kind of where we are, and we're all in this together, and it's going to be okay. We continue to be here for you, just in a modified way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Meredith. That's actually a wonderful way to end from this perspective, and having you guys give your side and what you're hearing from your teams is really important. What I wanted to do is certainly get to some of these questions that we've had come in from our participants on the call, and make sure that we get to a few of these before the hour ends. I would say that if there any reason we don't get to all the questions, please know that I'll get them out to our panelists so they can take a look at them and get the responses back out to everyone who joined us today. A lot of questions, I would say, Bob, for you on the household goods side of the business. I'll consolidate a couple of them, but I think we just, if we can hit on a few of them. I would say, obviously, some employees had to evacuate their locations that they were in fairly quickly. And a question came in that's, is it possible to get packing services to that small amount of goods that were left behind? And can they be sent via FedEx or DHL? So I'll leave that for you to give some insight on to the group, Bob.
Yes, I would say it is possible if the particular country doesn't have restrictions for the agency to go out. Again, it depends on the country, but most countries do have some sort of limited service where the crews can go in. Now, assuming that if they had to immediately get out, the goods are there without the owner. So some agents, they can go in to ensure that they get those goods packed up without the owner present. There's just some additional requirements and paperwork that will require. But if it's a small amount, the country allows the services to continue. Those agents can go in. They can pack up the goods. We do have FedEx, we do have UPS, we have other options for air carriers, including some of our other carriers, to get those freight to the other destination. And then that's the other question, will the destination country allow goods coming in from the origin country? So if everything lines up, yes, it is possible, but we just need to investigate those on a case-by-case basis.
So Bob, with that, are you seeing, those a little slight restrictions being lifted? So for example, like a Singapore, where there's certainly a lot of volume in and out of Singapore, and with restrictions starting to lift a little bit, right, in Asia, are you seeing more movement, let's say, from Singapore to potentially like the EU? Anything that is giving you an indication that, hopefully things are starting to get back a little bit on track?
Yeah, and even in Singapore, they are still on a partial lockdown until May 4th. The moving is considered essential service provider, so we are getting into those areas, and the crews are taking those extra precautions. So we do see some of those movements, yes. Again, they are handling it on a case-by-case basis when they're restricting some of these limited services. So it is possible, but it's just working through the scenario. How much is it going by an air carrier? Do we need it as a sea shipment? And then working through those any limitations we have in the supply chain. But it's starting to, it's not completely returned, but we do see that the partial lockdown is impacting some of the services.
Thanks, Bob. Meredith, we did have a question in, and I'm going to throw it over to you from a destination side. Are you seeing any relief on lease breaks, through the destination services group?
Some of that is specifically regulated by states or countries, governments, local governments, etc. So it's really a case-by-case basis. Mostly we're seeing that landlords are, struggling and challenged by this the way the rest of us are. And so if somebody was held, had a lease term to a certain amount, they're holding to that. But we're seeing various things where we're lots of landlords are allowing month-to-month extensions because people are stuck there. So that I think that's the biggest give we've seen from landlords, which has been nice. We are trying to negotiate those as much as we possibly can. There's also some laws in the US that allow for rent forgiveness. So we actually do some work in property management as well. So we're on the other side representing the landlord, making sure that rents are getting paid or they can't be paid. So yeah, that gets a little bit complicated. We're definitely seeing that, but more on a case-by-case basis.
Great. Steve, actually, you and I on one of our calls had brought up some mobility strategies for companies to consider and watch out for. One of them was around leases, especially in the corporate apartment area. I was wondering if you could tie in what we talked about to this question about lease breaks.
Yeah, I think if I were trying to hone in on what I could do differently as we move forward, one of the things I may request would be, regardless of who you're working with on temporary housing, is just real clarity on what termination clauses are at different properties. And again, it's going to go back to there's going to be a big difference between what you see inside the United States and what you see outside the United States. And so more common what you would see with termination clauses inside the US, just as people will see notice to vacate clauses with temporary housing inside the US, whereas that doesn't generally exist outside the US. And that's because in the United States, the properties, all the apartment complexes all require a notice to vacate. So a lot of times your temporary housing company is mimicking what the property requires. Whereas outside the United States, because it's static inventory and they just have low demand, they are getting more competitive with the types of termination and lease breaks that they're offering. But I think the best thing to do is just to require as much information as possible. So just a lot of clarity around what is the lease break, what is the termination fee for each temporary housing option that's being provided. And then based off of that, you can determine whether or not for your program that's a risk that's acceptable or not. But I think it starts with a lot of honesty and clarity with what those termination clauses are. From that point moving forward, then you could think, okay, if that is something that is a high priority for our organization, and we want to rank that as a higher criteria in terms of what temporary housing options we want booked for our transferees, then I would just say to think about if you want to rank that as a higher priority, what do you want to recalibrate in terms of the other priorities, right? And so I know typically a lot of it revolves around budget. It could revolve around number of bedrooms. It could revolve around distance to the office. Whereas now I would think about maybe shuffling around those priorities a little bit to say, let's look at ones that have a little bit more aggressive termination clauses that will provide us with a little bit more flexibility. Maybe I'm going to rank a little bit higher having an additional bedroom to create, if there is a quarantine required in a future wave, that they can have an office space to work from. But really around the termination policy, just a lot of clarity and honesty up front with what each property is able to do. And then just a determination from you in terms of your organization's priorities with the amount of risk that you find acceptable with those types of termination clauses. But I do think it's important to separate those between the United States and outside the United States, just because of how different the supply works in both areas of the world.
So with that, Steve, is there from outside the United States, whether it's APAC or Europe, APAC, I think certainly there's some key cities in Europe. What would you see as some key locations to watch out for from a temp housing and a lease break, and ensuring that some of those clauses and lease breaks go into the agreement? What are some of the top cities that you would?
I mean, I don't know that there's actually particular top cities, because we've really seen outside the United States almost all the properties getting significantly more liberal with their termination clauses. And it may not be something that continues on forever, most likely won't. but they're trying to show that they understand the dynamic of what people are living in today. And so we've seen a lot of maybe a 7-day lease break. Sometimes if you haven't moved in, and you can let them know 24 to 48 hours prior. But that's why it's really important that it's communicated, because there's not consistency from property to property, even within one particular city. So I would say that you should expect it to be more liberal than what you've ever seen in the past. But some properties may hold strong, in which case they're probably not going to get booked as often. And some are choosing to be more understanding and more liberal with their clauses, in which case our expectation would be, from a customer standpoint, those are going to get prioritized higher, and they're probably going to get the demand a lot faster. But I don't think it comes down to city by city. I think it's really outside the United States, because it's that brick and mortar business model. They're all getting really pretty aggressive with their termination clauses.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Bob, I actually had an interesting question, and that came through. It didn't, it's certainly a different concept. And it was regarding U.S. household goods shipments. And the question was, should we try not to pack any goods unless we confirm that the goods can be delivered to the destination, based on local COVID guidelines? So, is it better to have the employees keep the goods in their house versus having them packed, moved to a warehouse, considering certainly overall cost of storage?
Right. Yeah, that's going to be a cost scenario in this case. So I'm assuming this is a domestic, intra-US, interstate question versus.
Yes, and even internationally, that's certainly a consideration, right? Because obviously in the U.S. you have employees who probably have to get out of their home. They may have sold it to go on their assignment, right? So there's certainly situations where they can't keep their goods in their house. But what are you seeing, and what are some of the recommendations?
I would recommend looking at the destination location first. So are we seeing that country or that other state? The U.S. From state to state, I would say it's more possible to get it packed and loaded and put on a truck. Less delays, less restrictions. No state has completely shut down. In the U.S., we are considered an essential service, so moves are continuing. So I would say it is more possible for an interstate move. If you're looking at international, you'd have to consider the destination location, monitor to see if that country is opening up, what the services look like. We will work through the issues of getting freight. There may be some delays, as I mentioned before, but if the person has to get out, most agents, not all, but most agents are also offering from some free storage, some SIT. There are warehouse handling charges, and knowing if that transferee is out of their home, what does the temp housing look like? So that might be an extra cost. But we kind of have to marry up the timing of what the destination country might look like to how long the goods might be in storage or temp housing, and do some cost estimations to help consult. So it's going to be an interactive dialogue to offer the best solution for the account and the transferee.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Bob. Beth, I've actually gotten a couple of questions in regarding immigration. I'm going to take the one about China, because certainly there's a lot of concern and with China and the movement in and out of China. And at this point, there's nothing going in. But the question was, from your point of view, is there any concern that China will maintain their position to suspend entry for all foreign nationals, including holders of valid visas, once the situation de-escalates? And is there anything companies are doing to prepare for the worst case scenario?
I think that a situation where China would basically close the door for all foreign nationals would be unlikely. There's a lot of foreign investment in China. A significant portion of their workforce relies on the expertise of foreign nationals. So to close that down indefinitely, I think from an economic perspective, would not be the most practical approach. based on the way the virus has, starting to go on an uptick again, I can foresee maybe the prohibition extending a few more months, possibly even into the third or fourth quarter of this year. But I think it would be unlikely that we would see China really doing a 180 on their current position regarding the employment of foreign nationals in their workforce.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Beth. Since we're coming up at the end of our hour, thank you to our supplier partners. We certainly appreciate you joining us and coming on to give your perspectives and help guide what this may look like as the countries come back up to business. I just wanted to as well thank everyone who joined us today. And a special thanks to our support team who's actually behind the scenes for us. Trevor, Chris, Libby, you guys made this happen and certainly appreciate it from our side. Please be on the lookout for our next webinar that's coming out. Some great topics to be discussed, both US domestic as well as global impact. We're trying to balance it out so everybody can get the information they need. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you.